Roberto has always had a complicated relationship with his memories of the orphanage. From the moment he was left at the age of 5, he could never shake the feeling of abandonment and loneliness. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The memories of that huge house, cold and dark, still haunted him. Even now, years later, he remembered every detail: the worn walls, the corridors that seemed to have no end, and the silence that dominated the place at night. The nights were especially difficult for Fernando. He used to wake up scared, in a cold sweat, after dreaming about the expressionless faces of the other children, all as lost as he was. In those moments, the only thing that seemed to calm him down was the soft, melancholy sound of a violin that he heard in the distance. That melody seemed to bring a little comfort to his wounded heart. Fernando's memories were also marked by significant events, such as the day he met Luana, a girl who, despite living in the same orphanage, seemed to have an indomitable spirit and an unshakable ability to dream. Luana became his only friend, and together they faced the daily challenges of the orphanage. The violin was a central element in Fernando's memoirs. From the first moment he heard those sad, soft notes, he felt an inexplicable connection with the instrument. For him, the violin was not just an object, but a connection to something larger, something he couldn't define but felt deeply. Roberto discovered the violin by chance. Once, exploring one of the orphanage's forgotten rooms, he found the instrument dusty and abused. Without knowing exactly why, he felt the need to touch him, as if it were a call from the past. When he pulled out the first note, something woke up inside him. The music seemed to tell the story of his life, each note a memory, each melody a feeling. Over the years, the violin became Fernando's refuge. In his most difficult moments, he took refuge in music, using it as a way to express the pain and loneliness he felt. The violin was not just an instrument. He was a friend, a silent companion who understood your deepest feelings. Fernando's arrival at the orphanage was an event marked by fear and silence. He was only 5 years old at the time, but the memories of that day were still clear in his mind. He remembered holding his mother's hand as they walked down the long hallway that led to the principal's office. With each step, the fear inside Fernando grew. And when his mother let go of his hand and walked away, he knew something was terribly wrong. The orphanage was a strange place for Fernando. The silence was oppressive, and he felt like he was being watched the entire time. The other children were also silent, and there was a feeling of fear and resignation in the air. Fernando, who had always been an extroverted child, found himself suddenly unable to speak, as if the orphanage had stolen his voice. The first days were the hardest. He cried every night, wishing his mother would come back for him, but she never did. The feeling of abandonment was overwhelming, and fear became his constant companion. However, despite all the suffering, Fernando began to adapt to the new environment. He learned to deal with silence and hide his feelings, becoming an introspective and reserved child. The sad melodies that Fernando played on the violin were an expression of everything he held in his heart. Music was the only way he found to release the feelings of sadness and loneliness that had accompanied him since childhood. Every time it played, he immersed himself in his memories, reliving every painful moment he spent in the orphanage. Fernando's melodies were not only sad, but also deep and complex. They reflected the conflicting emotions he felt: sadness for the past, longing for the family he never knew, and the desire to find a place where he could finally feel at home. Music was his way of connecting with these emotions, and each note seemed to carry the weight of his story. Despite the sadness that permeated his compositions, there was also a touch of hope in Fernando's melodies. He believed that somehow music could heal his wounds and help him find a path to happiness. And although he was never sure if it was possible, he continued to play, day after day, hoping that one day music would take him to a better place. The friendship between Fernando and Luana was one of the few things that brought joy to both of their lives at the orphanage. Luana was a brave and determined girl who refused to let the dark environment of the orphanage quench her spirit. She always found a way to smile, even in the most difficult moments, and her positive energy ended up infecting Fernando. The two met shortly after Fernando's arrival at the orphanage. Luana was the first to approach him. noticing his sadness and loneliness. She invited him to play, and little by little, Fernando began to open up to her. Their friendship blossomed quickly, and they soon became inseparable. Together, they explored the most hidden corners of the orphanage, invented stories, and supported each other in times of need. Luana also had a special talent for music, and would often sit next to Fernando while he played the violin, listening intently to every note. She understood the depth of Fernando's emotions and always knew how to comfort him. Despite her friendship with Luana, life at the orphanage was not easy. There were many conflicts between the children, who often felt abandoned and resentful. Daily coexistence in such a hostile environment generated tension, and fights were frequent. Fernando, who was more introspective, tried to avoid these conflicts, but he didn't always succeed. The orphanage was also marked by the presence of strict authority figures who rarely showed any kind of affection or understanding. The rules were strict and often seemed to be applied arbitrarily, which further increased the feeling of revolt among the children. Fernando Kai, despite his peaceful nature, could not help but feel a growing anger towards those who were supposed to care for him, but who seemed indifferent to his suffering. Conflicts at the orphanage also reflected each child's internal struggle to find their place in that hostile environment. Many of them had given up hope of being adopted and were resigned to a life of uncertainty and fear. Fernando, on the other hand, still nurtured a small flame of hope, fueled by music and friendship with Luana. The day Fernando lost his violin was one of the most painful of his life. The instrument, which he had found by chance and which had become his emotional refuge, mysteriously disappeared. Fernando searched every corner of the orphanage, desperate to find his violin, but it seemed to have disappeared without a trace. The disappearance of the violin deeply affected Fernando. He felt like a part of himself had been ripped away, and the sadness he used to express through music now had nowhere to go. Luana tried to comfort him, but nothing seemed to ease Fernando's pain. He isolated himself further, refusing to speak or participate in orphanage activities. Eventually, the violin was found by one of the caregivers, hidden in a forgotten corner of the orphanage. Fernando was relieved to see him again, but the incident left deep marks on his heart. He realized that his connection with the violin was stronger than he imagined, and that without it, his life seemed to lose all meaning. Polly was one of the most fragile children in the orphanage, both physically and emotionally. From a young age, she dreamed of escaping that dark place and finding a better life. Polly couldn't remember living anywhere else, but she hoped that somewhere there was a loving family waiting for her. Polly's dreams were her way of escaping the harsh reality of the orphanage. She often got lost in her fantasies, imagining herself in a beautiful, light-filled place where she could run free and be happy. These dreams kept her alive, but they also made her suffer, as the reality of the orphanage was very far from her fantasies. Roberto and Polly developed a friendship based on mutual understanding of their pain. Although they were different in many ways, they both shared a desire to find a place where they could finally feel at home. Fernando often played the violin for Polly, hoping to bring some comfort to his friend. Polly's health has always been a constant concern at the orphanage. From an early age, she was prone to illness and had a fragile immune system. This meant that she spent much of her childhood in hospital beds or isolated from other children. This delicate physical condition made her even more vulnerable, both emotionally and physically. Polly's health deteriorated. She became increasingly weaker and spent more time in bed. Fernando, who cared deeply about his friend, did his best to cheer her up. He read her stories, played the violin, and tried to bring some joy to her dark days. However, despite Fernando's efforts, Polly's condition continued to worsen. Every day she seemed more distant, as if she was slowly turning off the world. The doctors at the orphanage did what they could, but the situation was delicate. Fernando began to fear that at any moment Polly could be taken away from him, and this terrified him. Desperate to help Polly, Fernando began planning a way to get her out of the orphanage. He knew the chances were slim, but he couldn't just stand by and watch his friend waste away. Fernando began to observe the movements of the caregivers, looking for an opening that would allow him to escape with Polly. Roberto also began to gather small supplies, such as food and water, which he hid in a secret place. He knew the journey would be long and dangerous, but he was determined to try. The idea of seeing Polly in a safe place where she could receive proper care was the only thing that motivated him to continue. Fernando's plan was simple, but risky. He would wait until nighttime, when everyone was asleep, and then try to hang out with Polly. However, there were many obstacles in the way. Fernando knew he would need to be extremely careful not to get caught. Even so, he was determined to do whatever was necessary to save his friend. Mr. Regina was a mysterious man who appeared at the orphanage on a rainy afternoon. He was a middle-aged man with an imposing presence and an aura of authority. The children at the orphanage were immediately intrigued by him, and Fernando was no exception. Mr. Regina seemed different from all the other adults Fernando had met. There was something about him that inspired confidence. Mr. Regina asked to see all the children, and one by one they were taken to meet him. When it was Fernando's turn, he felt butterflies in his stomach, but also a strange sense of hope. Mr. Regina looked directly into Fernando's eyes, as if he were trying to read his soul. He asked a few simple questions, but Fernando felt that this man knew a lot more than he was letting on. After the conversation, Mr. Regina left the orphanage without saying much, but he left a lasting impression on Fernando. The boy couldn't stop thinking about that mysterious man and what he could mean for his future. Although he wasn't sure, Fernando began to hope that perhaps Mr. Regina would be the key to the escape he so desired. Days after meeting Mr. Regina, rumors began to spread around the orphanage. He was thinking about adopting one of the children. The news generated an uproar among everyone, each one hoping to be chosen. Fernando, however, felt divided. On the one hand, he desperately wanted to escape the orphanage, but on the other, he feared leaving Polly behind. Mr. Regina's adoption proposal was a surprise to everyone. He didn't choose a single child, but two, Fernando and Polly. The shock was great, and the other children were between envy and joy for them. For Fernando, the news was both a relief and a new source of concern. He knew leaving the orphanage was his chance to start a new life, but the responsibility of caring for Polly weighed on him. As preparations for the adoption were made, Fernando couldn't stop thinking about what the future held for him and his friend. Mr. Regina seemed to be a good man, but Fernando couldn't help but wonder why he had chosen just the two of them. Even with all these doubts, the opportunity to leave the orphanage was something that Fernando could not refuse. Mr. Regina's mansion was everything Fernando and Polly could never have imagined. Upon arrival, they were greeted by a vast property surrounded by lush gardens and ancient trees. The house itself was majestic, with its stone walls and huge windows that let in generous sunlight. Life in the mansion was very different from what they were used to in the orphanage. For starters, there was a team of staff dedicated to taking care of your every need. Fernando and Polly had separate rooms, decorated with elegant furniture and full of small details that showed the care with which everything had been prepared. For the first time in their lives, they had a real home. Mr. Regina treated them with respect and kindness, but there was an air of mystery about him that Fernando couldn't ignore. The man seemed to be always busy with important business and rarely spent much time with the children. Still, life in the mansion was peaceful and full of new experiences, and Fernando began to adapt to this new reality. Despite all the positive changes in their lives, Polly couldn't shake a deep sadness. Since they arrived at Mr. Regina's mansion, it seemed more distant, as if something was missing. Fernando noticed that his friend spent hours looking out the window, as if waiting for something or someone to come and get her. Polly's sadness was a mystery to Fernando. He tried in every way to cheer her up, showing her the beauty of the new house and taking her for a walk in the gardens, but nothing seemed to have any effect. Polly was still lost in her own thoughts, and Fernando felt like he was losing the connection they had built over the years. Polly's reluctance to adapt to her new life also worried Mr. Regina. He made a point of asking about the girl's health, and Fernando realized that the man was genuinely concerned about her well-being. However, even with all the care, Polly's sadness persisted, and Fernando knew that something needed to be done to help her find happiness. Celia was introduced into Fernando's life and Polly unexpectedly. She was a young woman with an air of calm and a serene presence that immediately won over the children. Their first meeting took place during a dinner at Mr. Regina's mansion, when he introduced Celia as a family friend. From the first moment, Celia showed a genuine interest in children. She talked to them lovingly, asking questions about their lives at the orphanage and how they were adapting to their new home. Polly, who until then had remained distant, seemed to feel at ease in Celia's presence, which was a relief for Fernando. As time went by, Celia became an important figure in the lives of Fernando and Polly. She took them for walks, told them stories, and above all, listened to what they had to say. The relationship between Celia and the children grew quickly, and Fernando began to see her as a mother he never had. Polly, in turn, began to show signs of recovery, showing that Celia's presence was having a positive impact on her life. Roberto and Celia have always felt a special connection, but it was music that truly brought them together in a deep and meaningful way. From the first moment Fernando saw Celia playing the piano in the large music room of Mr. Regina's mansion, he knew there was something unique between them. The music flowed from Celia's hands with an emotion that Fernando couldn't explain, but that touched him in an indescribable way. Celia, in turn, noticed Fernando's natural talent for the violin. Although he never took formal classes, his style was intuitive and emotional, charged with an intensity that came from the difficult experiences he had lived through. When Celia proposed that they play together, Fernando hesitated for a moment, but the idea of sharing his music with someone who understood his soul was irresistible. The first time they sat down to play together, the room was filled with a harmony that seemed to come from another world. Celia's piano perfectly complemented Fernando's violin, creating a symphony of emotions that captured the essence of their lives and their pain. The music they played together was not just an artistic expression, it was a form of communication, a language that transcended words and allowed them to share their deepest feelings. As they spent more time playing together, Fernando and Celia began to realize that their musical connection was something more than a simple partnership. It was as if the music was a reflection of their souls, and every note they played together strengthened the bond between them. Fernando began to see Celia not just as a friend, but as someone who understood his deepest emotions and who shared his passion for music. Celia, in turn, felt equally connected to Fernando. For her, he was a musical soulmate, someone who understood music the same way she did, as an extension of life itself. This connection brought them closer together in a way no other experience had, and it soon became clear that their relationship went beyond music. The friendship turned into something deeper, something they both tried to understand as they navigated their feelings. Music became the guiding thread of their lives together. They spent hours on end practicing, composing and creating melodies that were uniquely theirs. Each new composition was an emotional journey that brought them even closer. Celia helped Fernando improve his technique, while he inspired her to explore new musical expressions that she had never considered before. Ultimately, Fernando and Celia realized that music was not only a shared passion, but also the foundation on which they could build a life together. The musical connection between them was unbreakable, and they both knew that no matter what the future held for them, music would always be the anchor that held them together. The day of the competition was one of the most important in Fernando's life. Ever since he started playing the violin, he always dreamed of participating in a big competition, where he could show his passion for music to the world. When he found out about the competition that would be held in the city, he felt that this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. Fernando spent weeks preparing, rehearsing every day and perfecting every detail of his presentation. Celia was by his side, supporting him every step of the way, helping him improve his technique and feel more confident. On the day of the competition, Fernando woke up early, anxious and nervous. The drive to the venue seemed longer than ever, and his heart was beating fast as he thought about the responsibility that lay on his shoulders. He knew this was his chance to prove himself and to show that all the effort he and Celia had put into music was not in vain. Celia, who accompanied him to the place, was equally nervous, but tried to hide it so as not to increase Fernando's anxiety. When they arrived at the auditorium, Fernando was impressed by the grandeur of the place. The lights, the stage, the audience that was beginning to settle in. Everything seemed so far away from the small music room in the mansion where he used to practice. Fernando felt a lump in his throat, but he knew he couldn't give up. He took a deep breath, remembering all the hours of practice and all the support he had received from Celia. When it was finally his turn to perform, Fernando took the stage with the violin in his hands, trying to ignore the looks of the audience who were watching him intently. The music he had chosen was a composition he and Celia had created together, a piece that represented the emotional journey they had been on. When he started playing, Fernando focused on each note, each movement, trying to channel all his emotion into the music. The performance seemed to last an eternity, and at the same time it passed in the blink of an eye. When he finished, Fernando felt a mixture of relief and uncertainty. He knew he had done his best, but he wasn't sure if that would be enough. Applauded by the audience, he left the stage and met Celia backstage, where she hugged him with pride and affection. Fernando's heart beat faster than ever. He and Celia were sitting in the audience, anxiously waiting to hear the results. When the presenter started reading the names of the finalists, Fernando could barely breathe. Every second seemed to drag by, and the tension in the air was palpable. Fernando's name was not called. He fell silent, unable to process what had just happened. Celia, at his side, held his hand and tried to offer comfort, but he was in shock. The disappointment was crushing. Fernando had dedicated himself entirely to this competition, and the idea that his efforts had not been recognized was difficult to bear. After the ceremony, Fernando and Celia left the auditorium in silence. He felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and shame. Fernando didn't know how to deal with the situation, and Celia's words of encouragement seemed to make no sense at that moment. The disappointment was deep, and he wondered if all his effort in music had been in vain. Fernando's condition tried to show him that music was much more than competitions and prizes. She reminded Fernando that the true beauty of music was in its ability to express emotions and touch people's hearts. However, Fernando could not avoid the feeling of failure that dominated him. The disappointment in the contest marked a turning point for Fernando. He began to question his abilities and his passion for music. The hours of practice, which were once a source of pleasure, have now become a constant reminder of your failure. Celia tried in every way to help Fernando overcome this phase, but he was increasingly distant and lost in his own thoughts. The separation between Fernando and Celia began subtly, but soon became impossible to ignore. After the disappointment in the competition, Fernando isolated himself, sinking into his sadness and distancing himself from everyone around him, including Celia. He began to avoid the rehearsals that had once been so important to both of them, and music, which had been the strongest bond between them, now seemed to be a source of pain. Celia, in turn, felt powerless in the face of the situation. She wanted to help Fernando, but every attempt to get closer was met with silence or indifference. She knew he was hurting, but she also knew he needed time to deal with his emotions. However, the separation was painful for her too. The connection they had built seemed to be disintegrating, and Celia didn't know how to restore it. The separation affected not only their friendship, but also the music they shared. Practice sessions became rare, and when they did occur, they were marked by tension and lack of enthusiasm. Celia felt that the music, which had previously been a source of joy, had now become a reminder of Fernando's failure, and this saddened her deeply. As time passed, Celia began to feel increasingly lonely. She wondered if the relationship she had with Fernando could be saved, or if they were destined to follow different paths. The distance between them was palpable, and Celia feared that if something didn't change, the bond they shared could be lost forever. Celia's suicide attempt was an event that deeply shook everyone around her, especially Fernando. Celia, who had always been a strong and resilient figure, seemed to have reached a breaking point. The weight of Fernando's departure, combined with other pressures she faced, led her to a state of despair that no one had predicted. Roberto, upon learning of the suicide attempt, was overcome by a wave of shock and guilt. He blamed himself for not realizing how much Celia was suffering and for turning away from her when she needed it most. The news made him reevaluate all his actions and decisions over the past few months. The thought of losing Celia, the person who meant the most to him, was unbearable. Celia was found in time and taken to the hospital, where she received the necessary treatment. But the incident left deep scars, both physical and emotional. When Fernando finally visited her in the hospital, he could barely look at her without feeling immense pain in his chest. He knew he needed to do something to repair the damage he had caused, but he didn't know where to start. Celia, on the other hand, was in a fragile state, both physically and emotionally. She knew that her suicide attempt had deeply affected Fernando, but she also knew that she needed to focus on her own recovery. Reconciliation between them seemed like a long and uncertain road, and they both knew they would need time to process everything that had happened. Reconciliation with Mr. Regina was a crucial moment for Fernando. The man who had welcomed Fernando and Polly at the mansion, and who had become a father figure to them, was always a constant presence in their lives. However, after Celia's suicide attempt, the relationship between Fernando and Mr. Regina became tense and complicated. Fernando's well-being was deeply shaken by what happened to Celia. He blamed himself for not having done more to help them both, and the tension between him and Fernando grew as they both tried to deal with their feelings of guilt and regret. Reconciliation did not happen overnight. It was a slow process, marked by difficult conversations and moments of introspection. Fernando finally understood that Mr. Regina always had the best intentions and that, despite the mistakes they both made, he was still an important figure in her life. Over time, Fernando began to open up again, sharing his worries and fears with Mr. Regina. Mr. Regina, in turn, made a point of showing Fernando that he was not alone and that he could count on his unconditional support. This reconciliation was an important step for Fernando, who began to realize that, despite all the difficulties, he still had a support network around him. Fernando's past has always been shrouded in mystery. From a young age, he knew that there was something about his origin that no one was willing to tell him. The only thing he knew for sure was that he had been left at the orphanage when he was just 5 years old, and that he never heard from his parents again. The few memories he had of his childhood were vague and confusing, and he always felt that something important was being hidden from him. As time passed, Fernando began to wonder about his true identity. The questions he avoided asking began to arise more frequently in his mind. Who were his parents? Why was he left at the orphanage? Was there any reason for the mystery surrounding his life? These questions began to consume Fernando, who decided to investigate his past. He began searching for information, talking to people who might have known his parents, and exploring every clue he could find. The search for answers became an obsession, and Fernando was determined to discover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. However, the more Fernando investigated, the more he realized that the truth was complex and full of twists. Fernando's past was more than just abandonment. There were dark secrets and events he could never have imagined. With each new discovery, Fernando felt more confused and lost, but also more determined to get to the bottom of the mystery that had shaped his life. Fernando's parents was a moment that changed his life forever. After months of investigation, he finally discovered the truth about his origin, a truth he never could have predicted. Fernando discovered that his parents did not abandon him by choice, but were forced to do so due to circumstances that were beyond their control. His parents were talented musicians who, like him, had a deep passion for music. However, they were involved in a series of events that put them in great danger. To protect Fernando, they made the difficult decision to leave him at the orphanage, hoping that he would be safe there. The revelation that his parents loved him and did everything they could to protect him was both comforting and devastating for Fernando. Roberto also discovered that his parents had tried to find him after the danger had passed, but were never able to locate the orphanage where he was. They spent years looking for him, but to no avail. Knowing that his parents never gave up on him and that they always loved him brought immense relief, but also a deep sadness for the time lost. This revelation completely changed the way Fernando saw his life and his past. He now understood that he was not an abandoned son, but a victim of terrible circumstances. The discovery brought closure to many of the feelings of inadequacy and pain he carried, allowing him to finally begin to heal the emotional wounds that tormented him. Fernando's past was a moment of great emotion and meaning. After the revelation about his parents, he was presented with a series of objects and memories they had left behind. Among these objects, There was an old photograph, which portrayed his parents holding a baby, him, at the time when they were still together. Photography became a powerful symbol for Fernando. He spent hours staring at the image, trying to imagine what his life would have been like if his parents hadn't been forced to separate from him. The photograph also brought up a range of conflicting emotions: joy at finally having a tangible connection with her parents, and sadness at the time they could never get back. In addition to photography, Fernando found letters and musical scores written by his parents. These discoveries deepened his connection with them even further, as he could see that music had always been a central part of their lives, just as it was in his. The letters revealed the deep love they had for Fernando, and every word was proof that, despite everything, he was always loved. The reunion with the past allowed Fernando to begin to better understand his own identity. He realized that, although he had been separated from his parents, music was the legacy they left him, and that he would always carry that connection with them. The photograph and other objects became precious memories that Fernando would keep forever, reminding him that, despite difficult circumstances, his parents' love was always with him. Life in Mr. Regina's mansion continued to be a refuge for Fernando and Polly, but now with a new purpose: to fulfill the musical dream that was always in Fernando's heart. The revelation about his parents and the discovery of his musical heritage inspired Fernando to take his music to a new level. He wanted to honor his parents' memory by continuing the musical legacy they left behind. With the support of Mr. Regina and Celia, Fernando began organizing concerts at the mansion. These events were not only to showcase his talent, but also to share the story of his parents and the journey he had been on. Each concert was a tribute to the love and music that connected his family, and Fernando felt that through music, he was finally reconnecting with his parents. Fernando's musical dream also involved helping other children discover the beauty of music. He began giving violin lessons to children in the community, using music as a way to bring joy and hope into their lives. Fernando believed that, just as music had been his salvation, it could also be a beacon of light for others facing similar challenges. Mr. Regina's mansion became a center of musical activity, and Fernando dedicated himself entirely to this dream. He knew this was the best way to honor his parents and ensure their musical legacy continued to live on. Music, which had always been a central part of his life, was now the focus of his existence, and Fernando felt he was finally at peace with his past and his future. The love between Fernando and Celia blossomed naturally, as an extension of the deep connection they always had through music. From the moment they started playing together, there was an undeniable chemistry between them, but it took time for both of them to recognize that what they felt for each other went beyond friendship and musical partnership. Their relationship began to change after the traumatic events they faced together, including Celia's suicide attempt and the discovery of Fernando's past. These challenges brought them even closer, and they both realized that what they felt for each other was true love. Music, which had always been the link that united them, now served as a way to express feelings that words could not capture. Celia, with her caring and understanding nature, helped Fernando overcome his insecurities and accept the love she offered. She saw in him not only a talented musician, but also a man with a heart full of kindness and a soul that had suffered, but still had the capacity to love deeply. Fernando, in turn, admired Celia's strength and resilience, and felt grateful to have someone like her by his side. The love between Fernando and Celia was not without challenges. They both had their own scars and insecurities to deal with, but the mutual support and understanding they shared helped them overcome any obstacles. They knew that music would continue to be a central part of their life together, but they also realized that their love was much more than that. It was a lifelong partnership, built on respect, trust, and a deep affection for each other. The wedding between Fernando and Celia was an event full of emotion and meaning. After everything they had been through together, they knew they were ready to take the next step in their relationship. The wedding was not only a celebration of their love, but also a confirmation that they were committed to facing the future together, no matter what challenges might arise. The ceremony was held in the gardens of Mr. Regina's mansion, surrounded by close friends and family. Polly, who had become a mother figure to Fernando over the years, was there to bless their union. Mr. Regina, who always saw Fernando and Celia as his own children, was visibly moved, proud to see the two finally finding happiness together. During the ceremony, Fernando and Celia exchanged vows that reflected the depth of their love and commitment to always support each other. Music, of course, was a central part of the event. They played together a special piece they had composed for the occasion, a melody that captured the journey they had traveled and the love they shared. After their wedding, Fernando and Celia began a new life as husband and wife, ready to build a family together. They dreamed of creating a home where music was always present, where they could share their love of art with their future children. The wedding was not only the beginning of a new phase in their lives, but also the realization of a dream they both had, finding someone with whom they could share life, music, and love. The arrival of Fernando and Celia's first child was a moment of pure joy and fulfillment. From the moment they found out they were expecting a baby, they both felt blessed and excited to begin this new phase of their lives. The birth of their son was the culmination of all the dreams and hopes they had for the future. Roberto, in particular, felt a mix of emotions when holding his son in his arms for the first time. He thought about his own parents, the love they had for him, and the musical legacy they had left him. Now he had the chance to pass that legacy on, to share his passion for music with his own son. It was a responsibility he embraced with all his heart. Celia was also overjoyed with the arrival of her son. She had always dreamed of having a family, and now that dream was becoming a reality. The baby brought new light into their lives, and they were both determined to create an environment full of love, music, and happiness. They knew life wouldn't always be easy, but they were ready to face any challenge together. The musical legacy that Fernando and Celia hoped to pass on to their son was more than just a skill or a hobby. It was a fundamental part of who they were, a connection to the past, and a gift to the future. They dreamed of seeing their son grow up in an environment where music was always present, where he could discover his own passion and follow the path he chose. The arrival of their son was the beginning of a new chapter in the lives of Fernando and Celia. They knew the journey of raising a family would be full of ups and downs, but they also knew that with love and music, they could face anything. The legacy they hoped to pass on to their son was a precious gift, and they were determined to do everything they could to ensure he grew up surrounded by love and harmony. The final message for viewers of Fernando and Celia's story is a reflection on the importance of music, love, and resilience. Life is full of challenges and obstacles, but it is through these difficulties that we find strength and meaning. Fernando and Celia teach us that no matter what we face, we can always find a way to move forward, as long as we have love and support by our side. Music, which was the guiding thread in Fernando and Celia's lives, shows us that art has the power to heal, to connect, and to help us express what we often cannot put into words. Their story is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always a melody that can guide us back to the light. Furthermore, the story of Fernando and Celia is an example of how love can overcome any obstacle. They faced many challenges, but the love they shared was what kept them together and helped them overcome adversity. Their marriage, the arrival of their son, and the musical legacy they hope to pass on are testaments that true love is unbreakable. Finally, history reminds us that we all carry a legacy, whether from our family, our parents, or our own experiences. It is our responsibility to honor this legacy, pass it on to future generations, and ensure it continues to live on. Fernando and Celia's story is a celebration of life, love, and music, and a reminder that even in the midst of hardship, there is always hope and beauty to be found.